Hey there everyone, welcome back to another perfect pairing with me. Want a project that screams luxury? Follow along as we die cut and layer the gorgeous Craft a Flower Coral Charm Peony. And don't miss the final touch, a dash of shimmer to give those petal tips the ultimate glow up. Before we start working on the flowers, I'm going to grab this die set. This is the Bubbly Bumblebee layering die set. And it makes this gorgeous realistic looking bumblebee. And I essentially followed the cardstock layers that are indicated on the back of these die cut packaging. So I did start with vellum on the number 1 layer, jet black on the number 2 layer, dark chocolate number 3, but then I switched out fresh lemon for buttercup. And then on my 9x12 sticky matte grid, let's color up this little bumblebee. I want the wings to have a slight gray cast, so I'm using the warm gray Altenew Artist Marker set and applying a light shadow layer of these artist markers to the wings. I went from Morning Frost to Evening Gray, then to Moon Rock, and blended those 3 colors together with Morning Frost. I transferred the wings onto a scrap piece of cardstock so I don't stain my 9x12 sticky matte grid. Then after gluing the number 1 layer to the number 2 jet black layer, I'll use jet black fresh dye ink and a dedicated blending tool for my black inks and stipple this color on top of dark chocolate cardstock. This is the number 3 layer for the bumblebee. I want that fuzzy appearance to the bumblebee, so I'm not really blending this color. I'm more like dabbing and stippling this ink to the edges or the outsides of the bumblebee layer. And using that same technique, I'll use Chamomile Fresh Dye Ink. This is from the Golden Sunset Fresh Dye Ink family, and another mini ink blending tool, and I'm stippling this color on the periphery or the outsides of these buttercream layers. And I want a little bit more depth, so I'll take the next color in Golden Sunset, which is Snapdragon, and apply that stipple to the outside of the yellow layer of the bumblebee. I'll finish assembling the bumblebee, bringing in the dark chocolate layer to the jet black, and then glue down the 3 yellow segments to the dark chocolate layer. And then finally, I can use a little bit of glossy accents to glue down our little vellum wing to the bumblebee body. I want a little white highlight on my bubbly bumblebee image, so I'm using Cloud White Pigment Ink and a dedicated blending tool that I use for white pigment inks. And I'm stippling this color as I did previously on the outside or periphery of the bumblebee image. I feel like this is going to help still give that little fuzzy appearance to our little bumblebee, and this will act as a nice beautiful accent to our little floral scene. Pigment ink does take some time to dry, so I'll move it onto a tray and move on to other elements of my card. Another focal element that I want to use on this card is the Craft a Flower Coral Charm Peony. This is the November 2025 Craft a Flower Layering Floral Die Set subscription. And even though in my region my peonies have gone to sleep for the winter, I still couldn't help but break these out in anticipation for what's to come in late spring, early summer over in my garden. The Coral Charm Peony is an absolutely stunning peony flower and it smells gorgeous. And so I feel like I had to do it some justice by recreating this flower in a much more realistic looking fashion. But I also want to include a really luxurious twist into this scene. On these trays, I have die cut all of my elements already. So I die cut 2 of nearly every layer included in Craft a Flower Coral Charm Peony. And I cut all of those images from white cardstock. I die cut the foliage layers and the peony centers from Minty Mint Crafters Necessities cardstock. And first I'll start with my petal elements and also bring back in my 9x12 sticky matte grid. And as a personal preference, I like to organize and arrange my die cut elements in the order of which they're supposed to be glued in. And for the keyhole alignment system, I'm also arranging the die cut pieces in their upright orientation. So aside from the flower centers, all of my white petal elements are on my sticky matte grid. I've arranged the top half of my sticky matte grid to be one grouping of peony petals, and then the bottom half is the second die cut petals. Starting with another mini ink blending tool and pink pearl, this is from the Tea Party Fresh Dye Ink family. I'll just go in order from lightest to darkest value of ink and blend this color on all of the petals. I'm concentrating a lot of this color on the flower center and leaving a nice white highlight at the petal tips. And pink pearl is going to be my foundation color. I like to apply a lot of this light ink as I feel like priming the cardstock really helps blend future layers or subsequent layers of fresh dye inks for a much smoother gradient. And after applying pink pearl to all 6 layers, including the petal folds included on layer 6, I'll move down to the next value of ink and a fresh mini ink blending tool. The next value of ink is Coral Bliss in Tea Party, and I'll apply a little bit less of this color on the flower centers. On layers 1 through 3, I'll apply just slightly more of Coral Bliss than I would on layers 4 through 5. I want a lot of depth, of course, in the further back petals, and much more of a highlight on the petals that are more towards the recipient. In my reference images of Coral Charm Peony, I was really trying to preserve that beautiful white highlights on the petal tips and including a lot of that depth in the flower center. So I'll keep moving down the value of inks to Heartbeat. This is also in Tea Party Fresh Dye Ink Set. I'm also moving down to my next value of a mini ink blending tool. And I really want to deepen the petal layers in 1 through 3 and use less of this color on layers 4, 5, and 6. Right now, we're still establishing a foundation blend for the first 3 colors in Tea Party. But right now, I do want to apply a little bit of a detail layer to all of my petal images. So I'm grabbing the number 5 detail blending brush, and I'm still using the Heartbeat ink. And what I like to do is use the lid of the ink pad as sort of like a palette to soften and sort of paint with our fresh dye inks. This way I have a little bit more control in how much ink is applied to the petal tips. I just really want to make sure that I have some veining detail on the peony, some movement within the petals, and really showcase the nice ruffly texture of the peony petals and the peony flower so that the image looks like it's really overflowing and there's just going to be so much texture on the completed card. So once I've added Heartbeat blends and little veining details using the detail blending brush, I'll move down to Berry Mocha and again concentrate much more of this color to the center of the die cut petals for layers 1 through 3. And then barely touch the center of the layers of 4, 5, and 6. It might look like a lot right now, but once these petal layers are arranged and glued down, these added depth details and variation of value throughout the flower will help make this flower look a little bit more realistic. I am bringing back in Coral Bliss and that same number 5 detail blending brush, and I'll do similar motions that I did with Heartbeat. I want a little bit of variation in the veining details of the peony. So again, I'll use the ink pad lid to use as my palette and paint this color on petal tips and flower centers to help create that beautiful, luxurious feeling of these layered peonies. Then once I feel I've applied an adequate amount of color, that'll finish up the initial layering of the Coral Charm Peony. Now from experience, I know I shouldn't apply glue right away to these images. The ink is still pretty wet and we've applied a lot of layers of ink to these small intricate die cuts. So what I'm going to do is move them off to the side on a little tray, let them dry back a little bit, and we'll work on other elements of this card just so that ink has time to dry back and accept liquid glue a little bit better. We'll move on to the leaves, the peony leaves of Craft Flower Coral Charm Peony. I die cut these layers from Minty Mint Crafty Necessities cardstock, and I'll bring in the peony centers as well, the pollen containing centers. And to start, I'll take Golden Sunset again and Sunray Fresh Dye Ink, and I'll apply this color mostly to the center of the stamen, again leaving a nice little white highlight. And before I put Sunray away, I will actually apply just a little bit of this Sunray color to random areas and random tips of the peony foliage elements. Then moving down the value of inks, I'll bring in Snapdragon and apply just a little halo to the center of the first layer of the stamen. And then move on down to the darkest value of ink in Golden Sunset to Terracotta. And I'll apply an even smaller layer of this color to the center of the stamen layers. That'll finish the flower centers, so then I'll focus on the foliage elements of this card. In Frosted Foliage, I'll start with Eucalyptus and a mini ink blending tool, and apply a little depth layer, a little shadow layer to each of the foliage elements. Again, I'm trying to preserve the little yellow highlight that we added with Sunray Fresh Dye ink, and I also want to preserve the cardstock underneath, the Minty Mint cardstock. So with Eucalyptus, again, I'm applying a little bit of depth and also coloring in one of the flower's center images as well. Then I'll jump down to the darkest value of ink in Frosted Foliage. This is Forest Fern. And really just create a lot of interesting shadows and highlights on these foliage elements, and also color in the detail layer to the flower center. It's that little skull looking image. That's what I kept calling it in my head, at least. Then as an added touch, and just from experience in my own garden, I've noticed that the peony foliage elements had this little this little red highlight on the tips. So I'll bring in Heartbeat again and a dedicated blending tool and stipple this color randomly on the foliage tips, just as an added detail, and again in admiration of these peony flowers. If you couldn't tell, they're also one of my favorites, which is probably why I'm spending so much time making them as realistic as possible. Then just like the peony petals, I'll let this element dry back a little bit, and then we'll work on some other elements on this card front. New for November 2025 as well, this is the Craft Your Life Project Kit product release for this month. I thought this beautifully tied in our little bubbly bumblebee image, and I am using the add-on die set that is not included with the subscription. I just wanted the offset die cut layer for the lovely sentiments included in Honeycomb Haven. So I will use this "You Are So Sweet" sentiment, and you might have seen it earlier on my tray, but I went ahead and stamped this sentiment from Frosted Foliage in a gradient pattern. I cut 4 layers of the offset die cut to give this sentiment some sturdiness, as I anticipate this will sort of float off my cardstock a little bit. Then I'll glue down all 4 of these layers using my favorite liquid adhesive and let it dry under an acrylic block while I work on other elements of this card. So I'll show the assembly of one of the Coral Charm Peony layers. This is everything I'll need to assemble our peony. And I've arranged everything in numerical order, starting from the left, the number 1 layer, and then I'll move on to the right with our final number 6 numbered layer, at least for the peony petals, and then all of the flower center images go on top. So I like to apply glue to the petal layers and let it get a little tacky, just so that the glue doesn't spread so much on me and go on my craft mat, go on my fingers, go on my tweezers. So I'll apply that glue, let it dry back a little bit, let it get tacky, and then follow the order of the keyhole alignment system. So starting with base layer number 1, layer number 2 goes on top, followed by number 3, and so on. And the trick is you'll only want to apply glue to the flower center or as close to the keyhole image as you can, so that the glue doesn't show up on the peony petals. And then there are little folded elements that accompany layer number 6, so I'll glue those down following the layering guide on the back of the Craft-A-Flower packaging. Then after all the petal layers are assembled, then we can move on to the stamens. This will give a nice full center to our little Coral Charm Peony. Then after that, this little alignment layer goes in the center. This is what covers up the keyhole alignment system so you don't see it at the end of the assembly. I colored that layer with Berry Mocha. I'm not sure if I showed it earlier. And then my little skull image goes on the center of the peony. I colored that one with Forest Fern. And then this eucalyptus layer goes on top. I'll use these reverse tweezers to hold everything together. If you've got another acrylic block, feel free to use that to hold everything together. And then off camera, I'll assemble that second Coral Charm Peony. Now, I really want to amplify the look of these peony petals. In my garden, I've got a variety of peony called Buckeye Bell, and there's something really iridescent about the petals, aside from the stunning fragrance of these peonies. When the light hits the petals just right, they sort of shimmer in the sunlight. They've got a really nice velvet quality to them. So I wanted to bring that into my Coral Charm Peony. And to do that, I'll use a dedicated mini ink blending tool in Platinum Pigment Ink because I wanted the metallic shine but without an addition of another color. So I'm very sparingly applying this to the petal tips. And then I'll just use my thumb to diffuse the color a little bit so that when the peony hits the light just right, there's a little bit of shimmer, but not an additional color that accompanies the flower. So just for comparison, here's that second peony that I've assembled off camera. And you'll see the slight difference in the petal tips as I rock the images back and forth to my light source. So I'll repeat that on the second peony flower, just for that added luxury, a little bit more realism. And it's just these little details to add to your craft a flower images that help make it look a little bit more realistic. And I feel like it helps make your card just a little bit more special. Again, pigment ink takes a little bit of time to dry, but I don't anticipate manipulating these flowers too much more so we can start assembling them on our white cardstock base. So I'll keep the background very simple. Again, we've put a lot of work and detail into the peony petals, into the foliage elements. So I'll just start arranging everything on my white card base. I did foam mount the two peony images as well as some of the foliage layers before tucking them behind our peonies for a nice lush and full arrangement. I used the 1/16 inch thick by 1/2 inch wide and also the 1/8 inch thick by 1/2 inch wide instant dimension foam tapes from Altenew just to give this bouquet a lot more dimension, as if there isn't enough already on this card. I'm tucking in the foliage layers as I mentioned using some liquid glue. Some of the foliage elements are also foam mounted with the 1/16 inch thick instant dimension foam tape. And of course, we can't forget about our little bubbly bumblebee image. Probably to scale, this bumblebee is a little large. I'd probably panic if I saw this in my garden myself. But I'm just going to arrange it right here. I feel like this is a healthy spot for our little bumblebee to go. And it'll just help draw your attention to our little sentiment here. I did double up the 1/8 inch thick instant dimension foam tape, creating a lot of height on the "You Are So Sweet" gradient sentiment, but I feel like it just really balances and sits really nicely on this area of the card, and it helps anchor the scene with the bumblebee, peony images, and such. One of the final luxurious touches we'll add to this scene is some iridescent ink spray. I feel like the pink and green shift in the iridescent ink spray really complement our peony scene. And I'll apply a lot of this splatter to the scene, again, to really just emphasize that metallic, shimmery feeling in the peony petals. Then finally, I'll break out my crystal clear enamel dots. I haven't used these in a while. And with a little bit of glossy accents, I'll give myself a little bit of wiggle room with the crystal clear enamel dots and arrange a few of these on top of the peony petals, on foliage elements, as well as the background to give this scene a lot more shine and a lot of dimension. I finished this card by adding it to a folded note card base. And that'll finish this really extra special Craft a Flower Coral Charm Peony flower with added details like pigment ink, metallic pigment ink, splatter, and so much variation, so much ink blended variation in the petals themselves. I hope you enjoyed creating this extra luxurious card with me today, using a pairing of Craft a Flower Coral Charm Peony as well as Bubbly Bumblebee, and using different ink blending techniques to create a lot of texture and a little bit of shine that you can use on your next floral scene.